A young woman arrives in Texas with a suitcase and hope, but what awaits her at the end of that road isn't cleaning. It's 4 unwanted children, a man suffocated by burdens, and a house dying in silence. They've bypassed everyone who came before her. But Evelyn Carter is unlike any of them. Like and comment the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come, and stay until the end, because this is a story about what happens when a stranger decides to stay. The train station at Harlow Crossing was barely a station at all. Just a warped wooden platform, a rusted tin roof held up by 2 posts, and a hand-painted sign that someone had nailed crooked and never bothered to fix. Evelyn Carter stood beneath it with her one good suitcase and watched the locomotive disappear around a curve in the earth until there was nothing left of it but a smear of smoke against the pale Texas sky. She checked her watch. Then she checked it again. The letter had said 3 o'clock. It was now 4:15. There was no one else on the platform. There was no one else anywhere she could see, just flat, sun-bleached land in every direction, a dirt road that vanished somewhere out past a cluster of mesquite trees, and a heat that pressed down on her like something with weight and intention. Evelyn set her suitcase down on the planks and sat on top of it because there was no bench, and she was not going to stand in this heat for however long it took. She was 25 years old. She had $43 to her name, a letter of employment folded in her coat pocket, and a very clear memory of the moment 3 weeks ago in Kansas City when she had read that letter at her kitchen table and thought, this could work. The letter had come through a placement agency, Hartwell and Associates, domestic staffing, and it had been brief. A ranch in Calhoun County, Texas, required an experienced housekeeper for an indefinite term. Room and board included. Salary, $12 a month, which was better than what she'd been making at the laundry. The work, cooking, cleaning, general upkeep of a large household. The household? 1 adult male? Employer. References required. Apply through the agency. She had applied, she had been accepted. She had packed her suitcase and bought a train ticket, and now here she was, sitting on top of her luggage in the West Texas heat, waiting for a man named Wade Mercer, who apparently did not own a clock. The wagon came at nearly 5. Evelyn heard it before she saw it. The slow creak of wheels, the plodding rhythm of a horse that had done this run too many times to care about it anymore. The wagon that appeared from the tree line was nothing fancy. A working rig, 2 horses, a flatbed with wooden sides. The man driving it had his hat pulled low and was not moving with any particular urgency. He pulled up to the platform without ceremony and set the brake. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she thought, broad-shouldered in the way men who worked with their hands often were, with a jaw that needed a razor and eyes that took her in with the same practical assessment she'd seen men give livestock at market. Not unkind. Not kind either. Just measuring. "Miss Carter," he said. "That's right," she said. "You're 2 hours late." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. More like he'd expected pushback and had just clocked which direction it was coming from. "Had a fence line to check," he said. "The cattle don't wait." "I see." She picked up her suitcase and waited. He didn't get down to help her with it. She noted that, tucked it away, and climbed up onto the wagon seat herself. He reached past her and took the suitcase from her hand, not gallantly, just efficiently, the way you'd move something that was in the way, and set it behind the seat. "It's about an hour's ride," he said. "Fine." They didn't talk much on the way. He pointed out a dry creek bed where water sometimes ran in spring. She nodded. She watched the land change as they moved deeper into it. The sparse grass, the occasional cedar, the sky opening up wider than she'd ever seen sky open up in Kansas. It was beautiful in a stripped-down, indifferent way, like something that had never needed to be pretty and knew it. She tried once. "The agency said the position is indefinite term. Is there something specific you're hoping to accomplish, or is it just general upkeep?" "General upkeep," he said, after a pause that was a beat too long. She looked at him. He was looking at the road. She decided to wait until they arrived. The ranch house appeared at the end of a long dirt track, behind a gate with the name Mercer, burned into the crossbeam. It was a real house. 2 stories, wide porch, stone foundation, but it had the look of a place that had gone without attention for a significant stretch of time. The window glass was dusty. The porch railing had a section missing. The kitchen garden along the south wall was mostly weeds. Evelyn took that in quickly because what stopped her from cataloging the house's deficiencies was what was sitting on the porch. 4 children. They were lined up on the porch steps like they'd been placed there, or like they'd placed themselves there, which was somehow worse. The oldest was a boy of maybe 13, lean and watchful, with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that made him look like a small, tired man. Next to him was a girl, perhaps 9 or 10, holding a younger girl by the hand. The younger girl was maybe 6 and was gripping a threadbare cloth rabbit so tightly that the rabbit was being strangled. And at the end of the line, half hidden behind the oldest boy's leg, was a very small boy, 4, maybe 5, who was staring at Evelyn with the kind of round-eyed, solemn intensity that small children reserve for things they weren't sure about yet. Wade Mercer set the brake on the wagon and climbed down. Evelyn stayed where she was. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice was very calm and very quiet. "Yes." The agency letter said 1 adult male, employer, household upkeep. He didn't answer right away. He tied off the horses with his back half turned to her. "The letter said household upkeep," he said finally. "That's what this is." "This," she said, "is 4 children." He turned around then, and she could see that he knew this was a problem, and had known it was a problem, and had chosen not to solve it before she arrived, which told her something about him. Not that he was dishonest, exactly. More that he was a man who had gotten so deep into a desperate situation that he'd stopped being able to see it from the outside. "Their mother passed 8 months ago," he said. "I have had 5 housekeepers since then. None of them stayed past the first week." The oldest boy on the porch had not moved. He was watching Evelyn with an expression that said he'd heard this conversation before, had probably heard it 5 times before, in almost these exact words, and was waiting to see how it ended because he already knew how it was going to end. That look was what did it. Not the little one with the rabbit, not even the small boy hiding behind his brother's leg. It was that 13-year-old's face, so carefully arranged into something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite resignation, but was some exhausted territory in between. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon. She picked up her suitcase herself. Wade moved to take it, and she shook her head slightly, just once, and she walked to the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "I'm Evelyn Carter," she said, to the children directly. "I've come from Kansas. I'm a housekeeper." She looked at the oldest boy. "What's your name?" A long pause. Then, "Ethan? And yours?" To the girl with the younger one in tow. "Clara." The girl's voice was cautious. "And this is Lily." Lily clutched the rabbit and said nothing. "And the one behind you?" Evelyn said. Ethan glanced back, then at her. "Owen. He doesn't talk to strangers." "That's sensible," Evelyn said. "I don't blame him." She looked up at the house. The dirty windows, the gap in the porch railing, the general air of a place that had been running on nothing but necessity for too long. Then she looked at Wade Mercer, who was standing a few feet back with his hat in his hands. "I'll tell you what I'll do," she said. And she said it to him, not to the children, though she was aware the children were listening to every syllable. "I'll give it 1 week, 7 days. At the end of 7 days, I'll tell you whether I'm staying or going, and you'll accept my decision without argument." She paused. "And the next time you hire someone through an agency, you tell them the truth about what the position involves. This isn't right." He held her gaze. Something shifted in it. Not quite shame, but something adjacent. "No," he said. "It isn't." She nodded once, picked up her suitcase, and walked into the house. The inside wasn't as bad as it could have been. It was bad, but not unfixable. The front room had dishes stacked on the sideboard that no one had gotten to. 2 days' worth, maybe 3. The floor had been swept recently, but not mopped. The curtains were gray with dust. In the kitchen, the wood box was low, and the stove had a grease buildup on the back that was going to require elbow grease and time she didn't have tonight. There was food, a haunch of something in the cool box, potatoes in a sack, dried beans on the shelf. Enough to work with. The stairs were solid. The upstairs hall had 4 doors, 3 bedrooms, and a storage room. She picked the storage room herself. It had a narrow cot, a small window, and a hook on the wall, she thought, because the 3 bedrooms belonged to the children, and it wasn't her place to displace anyone. She unpacked her suitcase with the efficiency of someone who had moved often enough to get good at it. Dress, apron, 2 books. A photograph she did not look at directly, but positioned face down on the windowsill. A small tin of salve for her hands. Then she went back downstairs and started supper. She didn't ask what they ate. She found the pantry and she assessed it, and she made what she could make. Salt pork with the potatoes, beans on the side, cornbread from the bag of meals she found in the back corner. Basic. Filling. Real. The children appeared at the kitchen doorway one at a time, in the order she expected. Clara first, hovering with that particular careful watchfulness of a child who had taken on more responsibility than her years could really hold. Then Lily, staying close to Clara's hip, clutching the rabbit. Then Ethan, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed again, watching Evelyn move around the kitchen with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Owen didn't appear. "Where does Owen usually eat?" Evelyn asked, stirring the beans. "With us," Clara said. Sometimes he takes a while." "That's fine," Evelyn said. "Supper'll keep." She set the table without asking anyone to help, because she didn't know yet what these children were capable of or what they were willing to do, and you couldn't build trust by handing out tasks before you'd established you were someone worth doing tasks for. That was a lesson she'd learned the hard way, once, a long time ago. Wade came in from outside when the food was on the table, hat off, hands washed. He looked at the spread, and something crossed his face. She caught it and lost it before she could name it. Owen appeared at almost exactly the same moment, slipping out from the hallway with his eyes on the floor and going directly to his chair without speaking to anyone. They sat down. There was a silence that had the particular texture of a silence that happened every night at this table. A shape to it, like something missing. Evelyn sat in the chair she'd placed at the far end from Wade and picked up her fork. "The cornbread needed more salt," she said, to no one in particular. "I'll remember that." Clara looked up from her plate with something almost startled in her eyes, like she hadn't expected anyone to critique their own cooking. "Mama always put butter in the batter," Lily said very quietly. Everyone went still. Lily seemed to realize what she'd said and looked down at her rabbit, which she'd placed beside her plate. "Butter in the batter," Evelyn said after a moment. "I haven't tried that. Does it make it richer?" Lily looked up, a very small nod. "I'll try it that way tomorrow," Evelyn said. "You can tell me if it's right." The silence after that was different. Still a silence, but a slightly different shape. She cleaned up after supper alone. Wade offered, stiffly, like a man who hadn't offered in a long time and was uncertain of the protocol. And she told him she had it and meant it. Clara offered too, and Evelyn told her she could clear her own plate and her siblings, and that would be enough for tonight. She stood at the kitchen sink in the dark after everyone had gone up, washing dishes by lamplight, and she let herself think for the first time since she'd stepped off that train. She had not expected children. That was the truth she kept circling. She had packed her suitcase and made this trip expecting a large, messy ranch house with a busy man who didn't want to think about dishes and curtains and whether the floor had been properly mopped. She'd done that work before. She was good at it. She was not sentimental about it. She had not packed for 4 grieving children who looked at her like she was already leaving. She did not know if she was staying. She had said 1 week, and she meant 1 week. Meant it as a protection for herself, a door she could walk through if she needed to. She was 25 years old, and she did not have an endless supply of herself to give away. And she'd learned that the hard way, too. You couldn't pour out of an empty vessel. But she kept thinking about Ethan's face on those porch steps, the careful blankness of it, the knowledge behind it. She dried the last dish and set it on the shelf and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the lamplight. 7 days, she told herself. You said 7 days. Decide then. She took the lamp and went upstairs to the storage room with the narrow cot and the small window. She lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her. The creak of old wood, the sound of wind pushing at the eaves, and somewhere down the hall, very faintly, the sound of a child crying with the particular careful quiet of someone who had learned to cry so no one would hear. She lay there and listened to it for a long time. She was up before sunrise. The house was cold, not bitterly, but enough, and she built the kitchen fire before anything else. She stood at the stove in the gray light before dawn and waited for the water to heat and thought about what the day needed to do. The kitchen first. A proper cleaning of the stove, which would take an hour at minimum. The curtains in the front room. She could take them down, beat them out, rehang them. The floor. She needed to assess the root cellar situation because the cookbox in the kitchen had been running low last night, and she needed to know what she was working with. She needed to find out where Wade purchased provisions and whether there was a regular schedule or whether it was ad hoc, because ad hoc supply management in a household this size was how you ended up serving salt pork and beans every night until the children's faces went flat with the monotony of it. She heard the step on the stairs, small, careful. She turned. Owen stood in the kitchen doorway in a nightshirt that was a little too short for him. He'd grown, or someone had forgotten to replace it, with bare feet on the cold floor and his eyes on her, just watching her. "Good morning," she said. Nothing. "You don't have to talk," she said. "You can just keep me company if you want." He stayed in the doorway. She turned back to the stove, adding wood, not making a production of ignoring him. After about 2 minutes, she heard the soft sound of bare feet on floorboards. He came and stood next to her at the stove, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, or he could feel the warmth of the fire, which was probably the actual point. "I'm making oatmeal," she said. "Is that all right?" He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. She made the oatmeal. He stood beside her at the stove and watched the pot, and when she poured it into the bowls, he reached up and took his own bowl from the shelf without being asked, which was more coordination than she'd expected, and he set it on the table and sat down and waited. She put oatmeal in his bowl, and he picked up his spoon. She sat across from him with her own bowl and her coffee and the quiet morning light coming in through the east-facing window, and they ate together in silence, which was not the same as eating alone. Ethan appeared next. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Owen already at the table, and something crossed his face. Quick, almost too quick to catch, before he sat down without comment. "She makes oatmeal," Owen said. It was the first thing Evelyn had heard him say. Ethan looked at his brother, then at the pot on the stove, then at Evelyn. "Thank you," he said carefully. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you a bowl." The first full day was hard, and she hadn't expected it to be easy. The stove cleanup took the full hour she'd allotted and a little more, because the grease buildup in the back was worse than she'd seen in the dark last night. She worked at it with a rag and lye soap while the children moved in and out of the kitchen doing the morning things children did. Getting in each other's way, arguing in the half-hearted manner of siblings who'd been arguing about the same things for years and had lost their energy for it. Clara tried to help with the stove, and Evelyn let her because the girl needed something to do and clearly wasn't the kind of child who could be idle for long. She had her mother's work in her. Evelyn could see it without knowing the first thing about the woman who'd died, because you could tell by how a child moved whether work had been modeled for them or left to discover. "Did your mother clean the stove often?" Evelyn asked, scrubbing. Clara thought about it. "Every Saturday," she said. "She said if you let it go, it got mean." "She was right," Evelyn said. "It did." Clara almost smiled. Around mid-morning, Wade came in for water and stopped when he saw the front room curtains down and the windows being washed. "The glass cleaner is in the—" he started. "Found it?" she said from the top of the step stool. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "The curtains? I'll hang them back when they're dry. They need air." She looked down at him. "Is there something you need, Mr. Mercer?" "I was going to say you don't have to do all this at once." "I'm not," she said. "I'm doing it in order." He watched her for another second. Then he got his water and went back out. She watched the door close behind him and thought, he doesn't know what to do with someone who knows what they're doing. She'd met that kind of man before. They weren't bad. They were just accustomed to either doing everything themselves or watching things fall apart, and they'd forgotten there was a third option. Lily found her in the afternoon while she was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds. The little girl came and stood at the garden's edge with her rabbit, and watched Evelyn yank up a sprawling mess of what might have been purslane ones. "Can I help?" Lily asked. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at her. "Do you know the difference between weeds and plants?" "Mama showed me," Lily said. "I know the tomatoes." "Then yes," Evelyn said. "Show me where the tomatoes are." They worked side by side in the afternoon heat, Lily pointing out what Evelyn should pull and what she should leave, with the careful authority of a 6-year-old who knows one thing very well and is glad to be useful. The rabbit sat propped against a fence post and observed proceedings. "What's the rabbit's name?" Evelyn asked. "Buttons." "Has he always been with you?" Lily nodded. "Mama made him." Evelyn pulled a weed. "He looks well loved." Lily picked up the rabbit and held him against her chest. "He's old," she said. "His eye came off. Papa sewed it back, but it's not the same eye." "Does it matter?" Evelyn asked. Lily considered this seriously. "No," she said at last. "He's still Buttons." Evelyn nodded and went back to weeding. That night after supper, which she'd made with butter and the cornbread, and Lily had confirmed it was right, and after the dishes were done and the children had been put toward their beds with varying degrees of resistance, she found Ethan on the porch. He was sitting on the top step in the dark, which was exactly where a 13-year-old boy who was carrying too much would sit. She came out and stood behind him, and he didn't turn around. "You should go to bed," she said. "I'm not tired." She sat down on the step beside him, leaving a foot of space between them, and looked out at the dark ranch yard. The horses were quiet in the barn. Somewhere out past the fence line, something was making a low sound she couldn't identify. "The others are asleep?" she asked. "Owen went down easy," he said. "Clara took longer. Lily cried a little, but she does that." The way he said it, the calm inventory of his siblings' states, the matter-of-fact knowledge of their patterns, told her everything. "How long have you been the one who checks on them?" she asked. A long pause. "Since Mama died." She didn't say anything. Sometimes the most useful thing you could do was not fill the silence. "She got sick in January," he said. "It went fast. He was here, but he wasn't, He stopped. "He was really sad." "He still is," Evelyn said. "Yeah." Ethan picked at a splinter on the step. "The last woman they sent, Mrs. Alcott, she stayed 4 days. She told Clara that some children were just too much work to help." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest that was not sympathy exactly. It was closer to a specific, cold anger. "She was wrong," she said. Ethan glanced at her sideways. "You're going to leave after a week." "I said I'd decide after a week," she said. "That's not the same thing." "It ends up being the same thing." She didn't argue with him because an argument wouldn't prove anything. Only time could prove the thing he needed proved, and time was the one thing she hadn't given yet. "Go to bed, Ethan," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and I'm going to need someone who knows where the extra bridles are kept, because I counted horses today, and I think your tax situation is a disaster." He almost laughed. She heard it, a quick exhale that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "They're in the barn," he said. "Third hook on the left." "Thank you," she said. "Good night." He went inside. She sat on the porch alone for a while after that, in the dark, listening to the West Texas night, which was enormous and indifferent and did not care about any of them in the least. 7 days, she had said. She was 1 day in. She thought about the photograph lying face down on the windowsill in the storage room. She thought about Kansas. She thought about Lily's voice saying, "Mama made him in the afternoon sun." She went inside and locked the front door and went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept on. The second morning was worse than the first, which she probably should have expected. She burned the eggs. Not catastrophically, not black, not ruined, but enough that the edges curled and went leathery and the yolks set harder than she'd intended, because she'd been half distracted calculating what she needed from the dry goods store in town, and had let her attention wander for exactly the 30 seconds it took eggs to go from done to overdone. She put them on the plates anyway because there was no time to start again, and waste was waste. Clara looked at her plate and then at Evelyn and didn't say anything. "They're overcooked," Evelyn said, sitting down. "I know." "They're fine," Clara said, with the practiced diplomacy of a child who had learned to manage the feelings of adults. They're not fine. They're overcooked. Evelyn picked up her fork. Eat them anyway. Lily ate hers without complaint. Owen ate his without looking at them, which was more or less how Owen approached all food, with a focused, methodical attention that suggested he'd decided eating was a task to complete rather than an experience to evaluate. Ethan ate half of his and pushed the rest around in a way that was technically compliant, but said what his mouth wasn't. Wade came in from the barn while they were still at the table, poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, looked at the plates, and said nothing. He sat at the head of the table and ate the eggs without expression. Evelyn decided she respected that. The day started in earnest after breakfast, and what became clear almost immediately was that the house had not merely been neglected. It had been managed by a series of people who each had different ideas about which problems were urgent and had addressed those while ignoring everything else. So the floors were swept in the kitchen and front room, but not in the upstairs hall, which had a grime along the baseboards that suggested months of foot traffic without cleaning. The root cellar had been stocked reasonably well, but organized by someone who had put new things in front of old things. So at the back, behind the turnips, she found 3 jars of preserves with handwriting on the labels that was not the same as anyone's handwriting currently living in this house. She stood in the root cellar for a moment with one of those jars in her hand, peach preserves, in a looping, confident script that said August and a year that was 18 months ago. And she put it back carefully, exactly where she'd found it, and went back upstairs. She did not mention the jars to anyone, but she thought about them. The curtains went back up that morning, which was when Clara decided she was willing to be useful in the kitchen. She appeared at Evelyn's elbow while Evelyn was standing on the step stool rehooking the curtain rings and announced that she knew how to make bread. "Do you?" Evelyn said. "Mama taught me." A pause. "I haven't made it in a while. I might have forgotten some of it." "Then we'll make it together," Evelyn said. "You do what you remember and I'll fill in the gaps." Clara's bread making turned out to be mostly intact. She knew the proportions. She knew how long to knead. She knew to cover the dough and let it rest in the warm corner near the stove. What she'd forgotten was how to tell when it was ready to shape, and she kept poking it anxiously every 10 minutes and asking if it was done yet. "Stop poking it," Evelyn said. "It'll tell you when it's ready." "How?" "It'll look different, and it'll feel different when you press it, like it pushes back a little, instead of just holding the dent." She showed her with her knuckle. "Like that." Clara tried it and frowned in concentration. "It's not there yet." "No, give it another 20 minutes. Clara gave it another 20 minutes and then came back and pressed her knuckle in and looked up. "There," she said. "That's it." "That's it," Evelyn agreed. The bread came out well, not perfect. Slightly dense on one end because the oven ran hotter on the right side, which was a quirk they hadn't known about yet and would have to account for going forward. But real bread, with a crust that crackled when you pressed it, and an inside that was soft and faintly warm all the way through. Clara cut the first slice herself and examined it with the critical eye of someone who knew what it was supposed to look like. "It's a little dense," she said. "On this end," Evelyn said, "the oven pulls hot to the right. Next time we'll turn the pan halfway through." Clara nodded slowly, filing this away. Supper that night was better than the night before because Evelyn had taken a proper inventory now and knew what she had to work with, and because Clara had quietly set the table without being asked, putting each fork and knife with a precision that suggested she'd been taught by someone who cared about the way a table looked. When Wade sat down and saw the bread already sliced in the middle of the table, something moved across his face. He picked up a piece and held it for a second before he ate it. He didn't say anything, but he ate 3 slices. Ensuite, the week moved forward the way hard weeks do. Not fast, not slow, but with a relentlessness that meant there was always something requiring attention before the last thing had been properly finished. Evelyn worked from before dawn until after dark every day, not because anyone asked her to, but because that was the shape of the work. Households didn't run on schedules. They ran on what needed doing, and what needed doing was always more than the hours available. She was tired by Wednesday in a way that sat in her lower back and the soles of her feet and the base of her neck, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. She hadn't done this kind of sustained work in a while, not since her last full-time placement 2 years back, a difficult household in Topeka, where she'd eventually left because the situation had required more of her than was appropriate to give. She'd done laundry work since then, which was hard but different, contained. You knew what the pile was. You worked until it was done. You went home. This was not contained. On Wednesday afternoon, she was on her hands and knees scrubbing the upstairs hallway when she heard a crash from Owen's room, followed by absolute silence, which was somehow more alarming than noise. She got up and went to the door and opened it. Owen was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of a wooden puzzle, the kind with interlocking pieces that made a picture when assembled. The puzzle had apparently been sitting on a high shelf and had come down, taking with it a tin cup and a small cloth figure that might have been a horse. The tin cup had rolled under the bed. The pieces were everywhere. Owen stood in the middle of it, looking at the cloth horse in his hand. "Are you hurt?" Evelyn asked. He shook his head. She came in and picked up the tin cup from under the bed and set it on his nightstand. Then she sat down on the floor among the puzzle pieces and started sorting them. Not assembling, just sorting, colors together, edge pieces to one side. After a moment, Owen sat down across from her and picked up a piece. They worked on it for 40 minutes. She didn't finish the hallway that day. The puzzle was a picture of a river with mountains in the background, and when they'd assembled about 2/3 of it, Owen pointed to the mountains and said, very quietly, "Mama had a picture of mountains in her room." "Do you know where they were?" Evelyn asked. "I don't know. A painting. She bought it somewhere." "Is it still in her room?" A pause. Pa closed the door. Evelyn looked at the puzzle. "The mountains in this picture are probably somewhere in Colorado," she said. "Or maybe Wyoming. They get that kind of snow on top." Owen looked at the puzzle mountains. "Have you been there?" "No, I'd like to, though." He put in another piece. Then, "Do you think they're cold?" "The mountains?" "Yeah." "I think they are," she said. "Cold and quiet and very tall. The kind of place where sound doesn't carry right because there's so much space." Owen seemed to consider this as satisfactory. They finished the 2/3 and agreed to leave the rest for later, and Evelyn went back to the hallway, which she finished by lamplight that evening, with her back aching and her knees sore from the hard floor. She did not consider it time wasted. Well, Thursday was the day she made her first real mistake, and it mattered enough that she had to sit with it. She'd found, in the back of the linen cupboard, a stack of embroidered pillowcases that were clearly handmade, fine needlework, small flowers along the edges, each one slightly different from the last, as though the maker had been trying different variations of the same pattern. She'd assumed they were stored away because they were delicate or because no one had gotten around to putting them on the beds, and she'd brought them out and put them on the children's beds because the pillowcases currently on those beds were worn thin and the children deserved something nicer. She found out at bedtime why the pillowcases were in the back of the cupboard. Clara came down the stairs with one of them in her hands and her face carefully arranged, and Evelyn could see immediately from the arrangement of that face that she'd made a mistake she didn't yet understand the shape of. "Where did you find these?" Clara asked. "The linen cupboard, the back shelf." Evelyn looked at the pillowcase. "I thought Mama made these," Clara said. "She made them when she was sick. She worked on them all winter." Her voice was absolutely controlled in the way that children's voices sometimes got when they were holding something very fragile. "We don't use them. We're keeping them." Evelyn looked at the pillowcase in Clara's hands. The small flowers along the border. She'd thought they were a decorative choice. They were something else entirely. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know. I should have asked." "It's fine," Clara said, which was what the girl always said when things were not fine. "It's not fine. And I'm sorry. I'll put them back exactly where they were." Clara handed over the pillowcase. "The back left corner," she said. "That's where she kept them." "Back left corner," Evelyn said. "I'll remember." Clara went back upstairs. Evelyn stood in the hallway for a moment with the pillowcase in her hands, and she thought about the preserve jars in the root cellar with their looping, confident handwriting, and about the closed door at the end of the upstairs hall, and about the invisible geography of grief that she was navigating without a map. She had meant well. That was not the same as having done right. She put the pillowcases back in the back left corner of the linen cupboard in exactly the order she'd found them, and she left them there. What she hadn't expected, what she genuinely hadn't seen coming, was Ethan. She'd understood him from the first day as the one who was managing things, the one holding the shape of the family in place by sheer force of will and routine. She'd seen children in that role before. She knew what it looked like. She'd been careful around it, not pushing, not trying to remove the responsibility from him all at once, because you couldn't do that with a child who'd built their entire sense of usefulness around a job. You had to give them something else to be first, or they'd have nothing. But she hadn't seen the anger underneath it until Friday morning. She'd asked him, the night before, whether he could show her the fence line situation on the south pasture. Wade had mentioned it was in poor repair and she wanted to understand what the property looked like. What were the priorities? Ethan had said he'd take her in the morning. It was a reasonable, practical thing. He knew the ranch. They walked the south fence line before breakfast, and he was fine. Pointed out the weak posts, explained which sections Wade had already pulled wire on, showed her where the cattle had been pushing through and getting into the feedlot. He was useful and precise, and she could see how much he knew and how much of that knowledge had been built by necessity rather than by anyone sitting down and formally teaching him. Then she made an offhand comment. She hadn't even been thinking. She'd said, "You know more about this ranch than most grown men." He stopped walking. "I know," he said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that was different from his usual flatness. Pa needed someone to know it. She recognized what she'd stumbled into. "That's too much for a 13-year-old, she said. "Somebody has to. Your father is here. He can work himself stupid in the fields and come in at night and not say 2 words to any of us," Ethan said, and it came out harder than he'd intended. She could see him register it, the way his jaw clenched afterward. "That's what he does. He works so he doesn't have to think. And everybody else stands around waiting for something to get better, and I'm the one who makes sure Owen eats and Clara doesn't fall apart, and Lily—" He stopped. "I'm the one who checks the fence line, because somebody has to." She didn't say anything for a moment. The morning light was coming in low and flat across the pasture, and the cattle were moving in the distance, slow and indifferent. "I know," she said finally. "And that's real, Ethan. What you've been doing is real. I'm not trying to tell you it wasn't necessary. But you're 13, and you are allowed to be angry about it." He turned away from her and looked at the fence line. "I don't have time to be angry about it," he said. "You're angry about it right now," she said, not unkindly. He didn't answer. She didn't push. They walked the rest of the fence line in silence and went back to the house, and she made breakfast, and he ate it without speaking much. But at the end of the meal, as he was pushing back his chair, he paused. "The hinge on the cellar door is rusted through," he said. "It's going to pull out of the frame before fall if someone doesn't get at it." "I'll add it to the list," she said. He nodded and went out to do his chores. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't some clearing of the air that made things easier between them. It was just a door that had been pushed open an inch, and she was careful not to push it further than it wanted to go. She'd been avoiding Wade Mercer. Not avoiding him the way you avoided someone you disliked, more the way you avoided a conversation you knew needed to happen but hadn't yet found the right shape. He was up before her most mornings and out of the house before the children were at the table. He came in for the midday meal when he came in at all, which was not every day. He was at supper most evenings, and he was present in the way that a man could be present while keeping everything at a distance he'd measured and maintained with some care. She understood it. She did not excuse it, but she understood it. Grief made some people move toward and some people move away, and he was a man who had always moved away. She could read that in the way the house had run before she'd arrived, the way the children had organized themselves around his absence rather than his presence. He hadn't become distant when his wife died. He'd been distant before, probably. The death had just removed the thing that had been bridging the gap. She spoke to him on Friday evening after the children were in bed. He was on the porch again. He came out here at night, she'd noticed, the same way Ethan did, which told her something about what that porch step meant in this family. She came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking if he wanted it. He took it. She sat in the chair at the other end of the porch, not the step, which was his spot. She was aware of spaces and what they meant, and she held her coffee and looked out at the dark. "I made a mistake Thursday," she said, "with the pillowcases." He was quiet. "I didn't know they were your wife's," she said. "Clara told me afterward. I put them back." "Clara cried," he said, after she came back upstairs. "I know. I'm sorry." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She doesn't cry much. She thinks she has to be strong for the little ones." "She does think that," Evelyn said. "Somebody taught her that by example." He looked at her. She met his look. "I'm not saying that to be cruel," she said. "I'm saying it because you should know. Ethan carries the fence line. Clara carries the emotions. They've divided it up between them, and they've been doing it for 8 months, and it's going to cost them something they can't get back if it goes on much longer." A long silence. "I know," he said. "Do you?" "Miss Carter." His voice was controlled but tight. "I am aware that this year has not been what my children needed from me. I am aware of that." "Then what are you doing about it?" The question sat between them. It wasn't accusatory, or she hadn't meant it to be, but she could see it landing hard. "I'm keeping the ranch," he said. "If the ranch fails, they have nothing." "The ranch isn't the only thing they need," she said. "It's the thing I can actually provide." She looked at him for a moment. He was a man who had narrowed himself down to what he could manage, which was the land and the cattle and the work, and everything that required him to show up in ways he didn't know how to show up had gone unaddressed. She recognized that too. She'd known people who did that. She'd done it herself once, in a smaller way. "You have a good son," she said. "He knows more about this ranch than anyone I've met, and he's angry that he knows it." Wade said nothing. "He's not angry at you," she said. "Not exactly. He's angry at the situation, but you're the situation." She stood up and took her coffee cup and went inside. She heard him on the porch for another hour after that, the slow creak of the chair, and then silence. Saturday mornings, 6 days in, 1 day before her self-imposed deadline, Wade was at the breakfast table before anyone else. Evelyn came down to find him already there with a full coffee cup and the look of a man who had not slept well and had been sitting in a chair thinking about it for some time. She didn't comment on it. She started the fire. After a few minutes, he said, without preamble, "I should have told the agency about the children." She put the kettle on. "Yes. I thought if I told them, no one would come." "That's probably true," she said, "and it might still be true." He looked at her. "Is it still true?" She turned around and looked at him. His face was tired and weather-worn and doing that thing where it wasn't showing what it felt but wasn't quite concealing it either. She thought about Ethan on the fence line. She thought about Owen and the Puzzle Mountains. She thought about Lily saying, "He's still buttons in the afternoon sun." "I haven't decided yet," she said. "I said I'd tell you after 7 days. Today is 6. He nodded and looked at the table. "I understand." She turned back to the stove. "For what it's worth," he said, "they're different this week. Clara made bread yesterday. She hasn't done that since—" He stopped. "A long time." "She remembered more than she thought she did," Evelyn said. "That's not the point." He set down his cup. "The point is she did it. She wasn't doing things like that before." Evelyn stirred the oatmeal. The kitchen was warming up from the stove, the early light coming through the east window the same way it had on the first morning, when Owen had come in barefoot and stood beside her at the fire. "Your children are not too much work to help," she said. "That woman who told Clara that was wrong." She heard him exhale, a long, slow breath. "Yes," he said. She was. The children came down in the order they always came down. Owen first, drawn by the warmth of the kitchen, taking up his post beside her at the stove without comment. Then Clara, then Lily with buttons. Then Ethan, who stopped in the doorway when he saw his father already at the table, awake and present, and looked for a moment like a child who didn't quite know what to do with a piece of his world that was behaving unexpectedly. Wade looked at his oldest son. "There's a loose hinge on the cellar door," Wade said. "You want to take a look at it with me after breakfast?" Ethan held still in the doorway. Something moved across his face, quick and unguarded, gone almost instantly. Yeah, he said. Okay. He sat down. Evelyn put the oatmeal on the table and sat in her chair and poured her coffee, and did not make anything of what had just happened, because making something of it would have been the wrong move. It was small. It was one morning. Nothing was fixed, and she knew better than to call a thing fixed that had barely started shifting. But it was something. After breakfast, while the boys were out at the cellar door with a wrench and a can of machine oil, and Lily was in the garden with Buttons, and Claire was washing the oatmeal pot with a thoroughness that suggested she'd been watching Evelyn wash dishes all week, and had drawn conclusions, Evelyn went upstairs and sat on the narrow cot in the storage room and looked at the photograph lying face down on the windowsill. She picked it up. A woman and a man, younger than Evelyn was now, standing in front of a house she didn't recognize. The woman was laughing at something outside the frame. The man was looking at the woman. Young. Easy. Before whatever had come after. She'd carried this photograph from Kansas to Texas in her one good suitcase, and she'd placed it face down because looking at it directly was still the kind of thing that cost her something she wasn't always sure she had left to spend. She looked at it now, in the quiet of the storage room, with the sound of a wrench on a hinge drifting up from the yard below, and Lily's voice in the garden telling Buttons to hold still. She set the photograph down on the windowsill, face up this time. Then she went back downstairs because there was still work to be done and she intended to do it, and tomorrow she would tell Wade Mercer what she'd decided, and she already knew what she was going to say. She told him on Sunday morning, before the children were up. She came downstairs to find him already at the table the same way he'd been on Saturday, coffee in hand, not quite rested. And she sat down across from him and said, "I'm staying." He looked at her. "Not because I've run out of options," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm staying because I think this family has a chance, and I think walking out would be the wrong thing to do. Those are my reasons." He was quiet for a moment, then, "All right. I'll need to know your supply situation, what you owe, who you owe it to, when the cattle go to market. If I'm going to run this household properly, I need to know the real numbers, not what you think I should know." Something in his face shifted. Not quite resistance, but the instinct toward it. Then it passed. "I can show you the ledger." "Good," she said, and got up to start the fire. That was how it was settled. No ceremony to it. She hadn't expected ceremony, and he wasn't a man who offered it. What he offered instead, over the following days, was a gradual loosening of the walls he'd built around the operational reality of the ranch. The debts, the shortfalls, the places where 8 months of a household running on patchwork management had cost him more than just time. The ledger, when he showed it to her, was not as bad as she'd feared and not as manageable as she'd hoped. The mortgage on the North pasture land was current, barely. The feed account at Grady's Supply and Harlow Crossing had a balance that was uncomfortable. There was a promissory note, she almost missed it, tucked between 2 receipts, made out to a man named Harlan Price, Calhoun County Cattleman's Credit, for $480, due in full by the 1st of October. "What is this?" she asked, pointing. Wade looked at where her finger was, and his jaw tightened in a way she'd come to recognize as the expression he made when something cost him something. "Operating loan," he said. "Took it out in March, after winter. I needed to get the herd through to spring." "And Price is the lender?" "He runs the credit arm out of the cattleman's office in town. Legitimate operation. He does loans for ranchers who can't get terms from the bank." "Which means the interest is high," he said. "Yes." She looked at the note again. The interest rate was written in small figures in the margin. She did the arithmetic in her head, and the result was not good. "This is going to take most of what you clear on the fall cattle sale." "I know that. And leaves you thin for winter." "I know that too." She set the ledger down. "All right," she said, which was what she said when she'd absorbed a piece of information and filed it and was moving on. "When does the main herd go to market?" "End of September, if the weight's there." "Is it?" He paused. "It'll be close." She nodded and closed the ledger and handed it back to him. She didn't have a solution to the Harlan Price problem tonight. But she knew it was there now, and knowing was better than not knowing, even when the knowing was uncomfortable. September arrived in stages. First a slight cooling of the overnight air, then the way the afternoon light started to slant differently, then the smell of the grass changing, drying out toward its autumn version. The ranch had found a rhythm that it hadn't had in 8 months, and Evelyn was careful not to mistake rhythm for resolution, but she allowed herself to notice it. Owen spoke more now, not constantly. He was still a quiet child, still given to long silences and careful observation, but he spoke, in his measured, earnest way, about things that interested him, the puzzle they'd finished and started another of, the hawks he'd been watching from the upstairs window, a rock he'd found near the creek bed that he believed might have something inside it if you broke it open. He had carried this rock around for 3 days before approaching Ethan about the practicalities of breaking it open without destroying whatever was inside, a conversation Evelyn had overheard from the kitchen and which had been one of the most serious discussions about geology she'd encountered. Lily had stopped clutching buttons every waking hour. She still had him, still put him beside her plate at meals, still took him upstairs at bedtime. But she'd started leaving him on the porch during afternoon play, which was a change Evelyn noted without commenting on. You didn't comment on things like that. You just noticed them. Clara was harder to read, because Clara had learned to perform all right very convincingly. But there were cracks in it now that hadn't been there before. Not the bad kind of cracks, but the kind that meant she wasn't working so hard to hold the surface smooth. She argued with Ethan at the supper table about whether the new calf's markings made it look more like a particular shape or another shape, and they went back and forth about it with genuine heat for a full 10 minutes, while Wade watched them with something careful and not quite named in his eyes. She cried once in the kitchen over nothing specific, just stood at the sink one evening and cried quietly for a few minutes while Evelyn was at the table writing a supply list and pretended to be very focused on the supply list, and then dried her face and went back to washing the dishes, and neither of them said anything about it, which was the right call. Ethan was still Ethan, still the watchful, responsible one, still the one who got up early and did the things that needed doing, but the set of his jaw had changed slightly. It was looser. Not relaxed, that was too strong a word, but looser, the way a fist loosened when the thing you'd been holding turned out to be safe to put down. Wade was taking supper with them every night now. He'd started coming in before dark instead of at dark, which gave him 20 minutes or so with the children before the meal, and he used those minutes awkwardly at first, asking stilted questions about their days, not knowing quite how to receive the answers, and then less awkwardly, and then one evening he sat on the porch steps with Owen and looked at the rock Owen had been carrying, turning it over in his hands with a seriousness that matched Owen's own, saying things about what kind of rock it was and where it had probably come from. She'd watched that from the kitchen window and thought, there it is. The thing that had been buried under 8 months of grief and overwork and the particular way some men shut down when they couldn't hold something together. It hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been sealed up under the weight of everything else. It wasn't fixed. She kept telling herself that. It wasn't fixed, and it wasn't going to be fixed by one good month or one honest ledger conversation or Wade spending 20 minutes with a rock on the porch. But it was movement, and movement was what you worked with. Machet. Harlan Price came to the ranch on a Thursday in the second week of September. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden when the buggy came up the track. Not a working rig like Wade's wagon, but a proper 2-seat buggy with a matched pair of bays, the kind of vehicle that announced money and the intention to have it noticed. She straightened up and shaded her eyes and watched it come. The man who stepped down from the buggy was somewhere around 50, dressed well for Calhoun County. Suit coat despite the heat, a hat that had been blocked recently. He was not fat, but he was well fed in a way that read as deliberate, the way men sometimes carried their prosperity on their bodies to make sure it was visible. He had the smooth, careful face of someone who had spent a long time learning which expressions were useful. He looked at the house and the garden and Evelyn standing among the vegetable beds, and he smiled in a way that showed teeth and communicated nothing. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for Wade Mercer." "He's out on the south pasture," she said. "I can send word if you'd like to wait." "I'd be grateful." He came toward the garden gate. "And you would be?" "The housekeeper," she said. "Evelyn Carter." "Harlan Price." He offered his hand over the gate with the ease of a man who had practiced offering his hand. "I hold the note on this property. Part of it, anyway. I try to make it a point to check on my investments personally. Evelyn shook his hand once and let it go. I'll send Ethan to get Mr. Mercer. She sent Ethan, and she brought Price a glass of water on the porch because it was the courteous thing to do, and she went back to the kitchen garden and worked within earshot. Wade arrived 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes, which she knew bothered him by the way he held himself. A man who'd have preferred a clean shirt for this meeting and hadn't had the option. Price was expansive on the porch, the kind of easy that came from holding the cards. Wade. Handshake. Good to see the place looking more kept up. Heard you'd brought someone in. Miss Carter, Wade said. She's been with us since August. Price glanced toward the garden where Evelyn was working, and she kept her eyes on the tomatoes. I'll get to the point, since I know you're busy. The note comes due October 1st. I wanted to make sure we were on the same page about that. I know when it's due, Wade said. Of course you do. Price's voice had the particular warmth of someone who had learned to deliver bad news gently, which Evelyn always found more alarming than bluntness. The thing is, I've had some conversation with my associates about the credit situation in the county generally, and we've had to reassess some of our exposure. Ranching's had a hard couple of years. Wade said nothing. If you're not in a position to meet the note in full on October 1st, and I'm not saying you're not, I'm just raising the contingency, I want you to know that we have options. One option being we could restructure. Extended terms. The trade-off would be putting the North Pasture land as additional collateral. The North Pasture isn't collateral on the original note, Wade said. No, it's not. This would be a new arrangement. Price spread his hands pleasantly. I'm trying to give you a way forward, Wade. I want to be clear about that. She heard what was underneath it, even from the garden. The North Pasture was the best grazing land on the ranch, the piece that gave the Mercer cattle their quality. Collateralize it and miss a payment, and Price could take it, and without it, the operation wasn't viable. Wade said very evenly, I'll have the full amount on October 1st. Good, Price said. That's the best outcome. Another careful smile. I'll see myself out. Miss Carter. He tipped his hat toward the garden, though she hadn't looked up, and walked back to his buggy. After the buggy had gone down the track, she heard Wade come down the porch steps and walk toward the garden. She looked up. He's the type of man, she said, who has already thought about what happens if you can't pay. Yes, Wade said. I know what he is. Is the herd going to be enough? He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. It needs to be. It wasn't enough. The cattle went to market on the 22nd of September, and the weight was close but not quite where it needed to be. 2 weeks of dry, hot weather in August had pushed the grass back, and the herd had come up light, not catastrophically, but enough. And the price per head at the Harlow Crossing market was down from the previous year because everyone in 3 counties was selling at once. When Wade came back from market and set the figures out on the kitchen table, the number was real, and it was not enough, not by $90, which was not a small number. He sat there at the kitchen table looking at the figures, and Evelyn sat across from him, and they both looked at them. I have some put by, she said. He looked up. No. It's a loan, not a gift. You can pay it back from the spring calves. No, he said again, and this time it was final in a way that she knew better than to push against. There were things men would take and things they wouldn't, and $90 from the housekeeper's savings was apparently on the wrong side of that line for Wade Mercer, which she thought was probably the wrong call, but she also thought there were moments when being right didn't help. Then what? She said. He was quiet. There's Grady's account, she said. You could ask for extended terms. He knows you. Grady's not the problem. Price is the problem. Then we go see Price. I'm not giving him the North Pasture. I'm not suggesting you give him anything, she said. I'm suggesting we go to his office with the payment we have and tell him when the rest is coming, before October 1st. Not on October 1st, not after, before. So there's no technical default to point to. Wade looked at her. He won't accept partial payment. Maybe not. But showing up matters. It makes it harder to move against you if you've been visible and communicating. If you go dark on him and miss the date, he'll have everything he needs. She paused. I've dealt with this kind before. They like paperwork. Give them paperwork. He rubbed the back of his neck. You said you've dealt with this kind before. Where? That's a different conversation, she said. He held her look for a moment, then let it go. All right, he said. I'll go to town. She went with him. Price's office was above the feed store on the main street of Harlow Crossing, a proper office with a proper secretary and framed documents on the wall, and the general appearance of establishment that she knew from experience was meant to communicate that the man inside it did not need to be questioned. The secretary looked at Wade's work clothes and at Evelyn standing beside him with the cool assessment of someone paid to be a first obstacle. Mr. Price is with someone, the secretary said. We'll wait, Evelyn said and sat down. They waited 20 minutes. She spent the 20 minutes looking around the office and reading what was readable. The names on the framed documents, the file names visible on the ledger sitting on the secretary's desk. Nothing useful, but the habit of looking was one she'd developed a long time ago, and she didn't turn it off. Price came out eventually, showed mild surprise at seeing them, and showed them in. Wade presented the payment he had, the market proceeds, minus the feed account and the immediate operating costs, and explained clearly and without apology what the shortfall was and when it would be cleared. $90 by the end of October, from a breeding pair he had a buyer for in Mercer County. Price listened with the expression of a man who is deciding something while appearing to listen. The note is due October 1st, he said. I know that, Wade said. I'm here 9 days early to tell you what the situation is. I'm not hiding from it. I appreciate that, Wade. I do. Price turned a pen in his fingers. The difficulty is that the terms of the note don't allow for partial. Mr. Price, Evelyn spoke, and both men looked at her. She'd been sitting to the side and had been quiet, which she'd done deliberately, and now she leaned forward slightly. You have, in hand, $390 of a $480 debt. The remaining $90 has a named buyer, a timeline, and a man with 8 years of ranching history in this county, sitting across from you offering it in good faith. She kept her voice very even. If you call the note on October 1st and move against the property, you will get a damaged operation worth less than the full debt. You'll spend 6 months in county court, and you'll have the entire Mercer account as a loss. Or you could accept a 30-day extension, collect the full amount in October, and maintain a performing note. She paused. Which outcome serves your investors? I do. Price gave them the extension. 30 days in writing, signed, and copied, a copy of which Evelyn folded and put in her coat pocket before they left the office. On the walk back to the wagon, she heard Wade let out a long breath. Where did you learn to do that? He said. I worked for a lawyer's family in Topeka for 2 years, she said, before the laundry. You learn things. He was quiet a moment, then, thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still need the $90. On. The buyer for the breeding pair came through on the 20th of October, and the note was paid in full on the 23rd. She stood in Price's office again while the secretary marked the ledger, and she watched Price's face when the final payment landed on his desk and the note was discharged, and she read in that face something she didn't like. Not anger, not disappointment exactly, but the particular look of a man who has been outmaneuvered on one play and is already thinking about the next. She filed it away. 3 days later, she found out what the next play was. Ethan came in from town. He'd ridden in with a list for Grady's, and he came into the kitchen with a look on his face that she'd learned to read as his version of alarmed, which was not a dramatic look, but a very still, careful one. Ethan, she said, what is it? He put the supply sack on the table. I heard something at Grady's. Mrs. Grady was talking to Mrs. Pell while I was getting the flour. What did they say? He stood there, and she could see him deciding how to say it. They said someone's been talking to the county welfare office. About us. About the children. She set down her spoon. Saying what? Saying that Pa's not fit, that the children aren't being looked after properly. He met her eyes. Mrs. Grady said it came from over at the cattleman's office. She stood very still for a moment, Price's face in the office when the final payment landed. The look of a man already on the next play. How many people heard this? She said. I don't know. It sounded like... He stopped. like it had been going around a while. She breathed out slowly. "Where's your father?" "South pasture." "Go get him," she said. "Please." Ethan went. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the room, the clean surfaces, the mended curtain, the bread cooling on the rack, the floor she'd scrubbed last week and would scrub again this week. She thought about a county welfare officer coming to this door. She thought about what that would look like to 4 children who had already watched person after person walk away. She thought about what it would feel like to Clara, who had been learning that she was allowed to cry, to Owen, who had started talking again, to Lily, who had started leaving buttons on the porch. She thought about Ethan's face on those porch steps the first day, the careful blankness of a child who expected to be left. Not this time, she thought. No. Wade came in from the south pasture with mud on his boots and his jaw already set before she'd finished explaining because Ethan had told him the bare outline on the ride back. She laid it out for him plainly. Price, the cattleman's office, the county welfare complaint, the timing, filed, as best she could determine from what Ethan had overheard, sometime in the last week, after the note was discharged. "He can't do that," Wade said. "He can't just file a false complaint." "He didn't file it himself, that's the point. It came from the cattleman's office. Could be anyone there. No direct connection to Price, nothing to prove." She sat across from him. "The complaint is going to result in a visit, maybe from a county officer, maybe from the welfare office directly. They're going to look at the property, at the household, at the children's condition. And if they find anything they don't like, there's nothing to find," he said. "I know that, but we need other people to know it too." She leaned forward. "Who in this county trusts you? People who've seen this place, who know your children, who would stand up for this family if it came to it." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Doc Hartley," he said. "He's known us since before the children were born. He was here when Ruth was sick." "Good. Who else?" "Reverend... No, you said no. Anyone else?" "Ed Grady at the supply store. He's been doing business with this family for 12 years. He rubbed his jaw. "May Tolliver. She lives about 4 miles east. She's been dropping food at the gate periodically. I told her to stop, but she didn't." He said the last part was something that might have been, in a different man, a rueful note. "She's got a mouth on her. She talks to everyone in Harlow Crossing." "May Tolliver sounds ideal," Evelyn said. "I need to talk to her." "Why you?" "Because she's going to be more useful if she hears it from me than from you," Evelyn said. "You're the one being accused. I'm the one who can tell her what this house looks like, what these children eat for breakfast, what Clara baked last week, and what Owen said to me about the geology of his rock." She held his gaze. "Let me handle May Tolliver." He looked at her for a long moment. It was the particular look he gave her sometimes when she'd said or done something that required him to adjust his picture of what she was. He'd given her that look in Price's office. He gave it to her now. "All right," he said. Done. May Tolliver turned out to be a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the specific energy of someone who had been the most useful person in every room they'd been in for 50 years and knew it. She received Evelyn on her porch with the assessment of a woman sizing up an unknown quantity and reached a tentative conclusion within about 2 minutes. "You're the one who's been keeping that household together," she said, not as a question. "I've been helping," Evelyn said. "The family's been keeping itself together." May looked at her. "All right. What do you need from me?" She told her. May Tolliver listened with her arms crossed and her face doing a series of small movements that suggested she was cross-referencing everything against a very detailed internal map of Harlow Crossing's social geography. "Price," she said when Evelyn finished. "I can't prove it." "You don't need to prove it for me," May said. "I know what Harlan Price is. I've watched him for 15 years. She uncrossed her arms. "Here's what I can tell you. Half this county will follow along with whatever they're told because that's what people do. The other half know the Mercer family from before Ruth got sick, and those people know those children, and they know what this situation has been." She leveled a look at Evelyn. "You said the house is in order." "Come and see it yourself," Evelyn said. "Bring anyone you want." May Tolliver came the following Tuesday with Doc Hartley and two women from the Ladies' Aid Society, whose names Evelyn memorized immediately, and whose opinions she quickly grasped were considered authoritative in most of Harlow Crossing's social territory. She gave them the full tour: kitchen, root cellar, garden, children's rooms, the pantry with its organized shelves, the mended fence line where Ethan had finally replaced the rusted post, the porch railing Wade had repaired the previous weekend. The children behaved like children, which was to say imperfectly and entirely convincingly. Owen showed Doc Hartley his rock, which the doctor examined with flattering seriousness and identified as likely containing quartz crystals, a revelation that nearly undid Owen's composure entirely. Lily offered everyone a piece of cornbread, made with butter in the batter according to her mother's method. Clara set out cups and poured coffee with the quiet competence of a girl who had been watching adults do that her whole life, and had recently decided she was old enough to do it herself. Ethan was in the barn when they arrived, and came in with hay on his jacket and the slightly wary look he always had around unfamiliar adults. And Doc Hartley put a hand briefly on his shoulder and said, "How are you doing, son?" In the particular tone of a man asking a real question, not a polite one, and Ethan said, "Better," which was also a real answer, and the doctor nodded. Before they left, May Tolliver stood with Evelyn by the kitchen garden and looked at the house. "It's not perfect," May said. "No," Evelyn said. "It's a working ranch with 4 children and a man who lost his wife 8 months ago. It's not perfect. It's real." May looked at her. "You're doing more here than keeping house," she said. "I'm doing what the situation requires," Evelyn said. "Yes," May said. "I can see that." She turned toward the gate. "I'll make some calls, and I'll be at the county office the day that welfare man comes to town to make sure he hears from people who've actually been inside this house." She paused. "The children seem well." "They are," Evelyn said. "They're doing well." The welfare officer came 10 days later. A thin man named Mr. Croft in a traveling suit, carrying a clipboard, and the manner of someone who expected to find a problem. May Tolliver was, as promised, already at the county office when he arrived in Harlow Crossing, with Doc Hartley's written statement and Ed Grady's word, and 2 of the Ladies' Aid women who had opinions and were prepared to share them with official county government. Croft came to the ranch in the afternoon. He walked through the house and wrote things on his clipboard. He spoke to each of the children, separately, which was standard procedure and which Evelyn had prepared them for without coaching their answers, only telling them to be honest and to say what they thought. He examined the kitchen and the food supply and the sleeping arrangements. He walked the yard and looked at the garden and the barn. He spoke to Wade for 20 minutes on the porch. He spoke to Evelyn for 5. "How long have you been employed here?" he asked. "Since August," she said. "And your assessment of the children's welfare?" She looked at him directly. "They are fed, clothed, housed, and loved. They are grieving a mother who died in January, which is appropriate. They are not neglected. They are, if anything, more looked after than most children I've observed, because their older brother and father have both worked very hard to hold this family together in a very hard year." She paused. Whoever filed this complaint did not do so out of concern for these children. Croft looked at his clipboard. Then he looked up. "Is there anything else you'd like me to note?" "The cornbread," she said. "The youngest child made it herself, with butter in the batter." He almost smiled. "I'll note the household is well maintained," he said. The report, when it came through 2 weeks later, found no grounds for intervention and dismissed the complaint. Wade read the letter at the kitchen table, and he read it again, and he set it down on the table. His face was not relieved exactly because it hadn't quite allowed itself to believe the other outcome was real, and so what came off him now was more like the slow release of something he'd been holding that he hadn't fully named. Across the table, Owen was eating his oatmeal and watching his father with the grave, careful attention that Owen applied to all important things. "Pa," Owen said. Wade looked up. "Doc Hartley said my rock has quartz crystals." Wade looked at his youngest son for a moment. Then, for the first time since Evelyn had come to this ranch, he laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a short, real sound, and said, "Does it?" "We have to break it open to see," Owen said, very seriously. But we need to do it right or we'll wreck them. We'll do it this weekend, Wade said. I know how. Owen absorbed this with satisfaction and went back to his oatmeal. Evelyn picked up her coffee cup and looked out the east window at the morning coming in, and she did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying, and she had learned in the past 2 months that the moments that mattered most in this house were very often the quiet ones. That's the letter from the Aldridge family arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Evelyn did the washing, and she found it on the kitchen table when she came in from the line with a basket of dry shirts and a headache from squinting into the November sun. It had been opened already. Wade had brought the mail in from the box at the gate road. He was sitting at the table with the letter in front of him, and his hands flat on either side of it, the way he sat when he was containing something. She set the basket down and looked at his face and then at the letter. "What is it?" she said. "Ruth's family," he said. "Her brother. Aldridge. Franklin Aldridge, out of San Antonio." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "I didn't know she had a brother." "She had 3. He said it flatly. "Franklin's the oldest. He runs the family business, land, some banking. They didn't approve of Ruth marrying a rancher." He paused. "They didn't approve of much about Ruth's choices, which is why she'd been out of contact with them for most of our marriage." Evelyn looked at the letter. "What does he want?" Wade turned it so she could read it. The letter was written by a lawyer. The language was lawyer language, careful and dense, but the substance of it was plain enough. Franklin Aldridge, acting on behalf of the Aldridge family, was petitioning the Calhoun County Court for full custody of the 4 Mercer children, Ethan, Clara, Lily, and Owen. The grounds cited were the documented financial instability of the household, the welfare complaint and investigation of the previous month, and what the letter called the unsuitable and uncertain domestic arrangement currently in place. The hearing was scheduled for December the 14th, 5 weeks away. Evelyn read it twice. She set it down. "The welfare complaint was dismissed," she said. "They're using the fact that there was a complaint, not the outcome." His voice was controlled in the particular way it got when he was very angry and had decided not to be. "They've had a lawyer pulling county records. The complaint is in the record, even if it was dismissed." "Price," she said, "has to be. He knew Aldridge somehow, or someone connected them. I don't know how long this has been in motion." He picked up the letter and put it down again. "Franklin Aldridge has money. He has lawyers. He has a house in San Antonio with a proper school district and whatever else a court considers suitable." He looked at her. "He's going to take my children." "He is not," she said. It came out with more force than she'd intended, and he looked up. "He is not going to take your children," she said again, more evenly. "But we need to understand what we're actually fighting. This isn't just about the welfare complaint. That's the lever they're using, not the reason." She looked at the letter. "What does unsuitable domestic arrangement mean to a court?" He was quiet. "It means a housekeeper living in the house," she said. "An unmarried woman employed in a household with an unmarried man and 4 children. To a family with money and a lawyer, that's the thing they'll point at." She looked at him directly. "Is that what you think it means?" He met her look. "Probably." "All right," she said. "Then we know what we're dealing with." She got up and put the kettle on because she needed to do something with her hands while she thought, and because the thinking was going to take a few minutes and she wasn't ready yet to say out loud where it was going. She didn't sleep that night, not really. She lay in the storage room on the narrow cot. She'd been offered one of the proper bedrooms twice now and had declined both times, for reasons she hadn't entirely examined, and she stared at the ceiling and let her mind work through it. The Aldridge family's lawyer had built a case around instability, financial instability, which was real and documented even if it had been addressed. The welfare complaint, real and documented even if dismissed. The domestic arrangement, which was real and not documented, but which a good lawyer could make sound like whatever they needed it to sound like in front of a judge who'd never set foot in this county. The children. That was what it came down to. Ethan, who was almost 14 and who had spent a year becoming someone no 14-year-old should have to be, and was only now, slowly, being allowed to be less of it. Clara, who had started crying again in normal ways for normal reasons, which was the healthiest thing that had happened to her in a year. Owen with his rocks and his careful sentences. Lily, who had left buttons on the porch. If Franklin Aldridge took them to San Antonio, to a proper house and a proper school, and all the suitable arrangements his money could provide, they would be fed and clothed and completely lost. She knew that the way she knew some things, not from reasoning it through, just from having been a person long enough to understand what children needed, which was not primarily proper school districts. She turned the problem over in the dark. The domestic arrangement was the exposed flank. That was where the Aldridge lawyer would concentrate because it was the easiest thing to make look wrong. An unmarried woman in a widower's house. In a county courthouse in 1887, she did not need to be doing anything wrong for it to look wrong. The appearance was enough. There was one thing that would make it not wrong, one clear, obvious thing. She lay there with it for a long time. She thought about Wade at the kitchen table with his hands flat on either side of that letter. She thought about the first night on the porch when he'd said, "I know," to her like the word had cost him something. She thought about Price's office and the copy of the extension agreement folded in her coat pocket. She thought about the photograph on her windowsill, face up now, the man looking at the woman who was laughing at something outside the frame. She thought, this is not how this is supposed to go. And then she thought, well, very little has gone the way it was supposed to. She got up before dawn and she made coffee, and she sat at the kitchen table in the dark and waited for him. Chuts. He came down at 5:30, the way he always did, and he stopped when he saw her sitting there in the lamplight. "You're up early," he said. "I didn't sleep much." She pushed the second cup toward him. "Sit down. I need to say something, and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." He sat down. He picked up the coffee cup but didn't drink from it. He looked at her with the careful, measuring look that she'd first seen at the train platform in Harlow Crossing 4 months ago, when he'd been assessing which direction the trouble was going to come from. "The domestic arrangement is what they'll use," she said. "You know that and I know that. A single woman living in a widower's household, a jury of county court sensibilities, is going to look at that and hear what the Aldridge lawyer tells them to hear, even if there's nothing there to hear." She kept her voice even. "There is one thing that removes that argument entirely." He was very still. "I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give," she said. "I want to be clear about that before anything else. This is a practical problem with a practical solution, and I am raising it as such. You can say no, and I will understand it, and we will find another way to fight this." She looked at him directly. "But if you were willing, if we were both willing, to marry before the 14th, the Aldridge family loses their clearest argument. The household becomes a two-parent household. The domestic arrangement becomes the family arrangement. It changes what the court sees." He said nothing. "I know this is not—" She stopped and started again. "I know this is not a normal proposal. I know the circumstances are what they are. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise or to make it into something it isn't. I'm asking whether, given the situation, it makes sense." He was still looking at her. She couldn't read his face, and she'd gotten reasonably good at reading it over 4 months, which meant whatever was happening behind it was something he hadn't shown her before. "Evelyn," he said. "You can take time to think about it," she said. "We have—" "Evelyn." He said it again, and there was something different in it the second time. "I need you to stop talking for a minute." She stopped. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "I have been trying," he said carefully, "for about 6 weeks to figure out how to say something to you that I don't know how to say. And every time I get close to it, I remember that you work for me and that this is your employment and that I have no right to make this house into something that makes your position here uncomfortable." She looked at him. "So when you sit down across from me and tell me that marrying you is the practical solution to our problem," he said, "I want you to understand that it is taking me a significant effort right now to respond to that as a practical question and not as—" He stopped, tried again. "Not as something else." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp was burning low, and the window over the sink was just beginning to show the gray pre-dawn outline of the yard. "What is the something else?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I think you know." She did know. She'd known for a while, in the way you sometimes knew things before you were ready to do anything about them. in the way he'd started coming in from the fields a little earlier, in the way he'd started telling her things he didn't need to tell her, small details from the day, observations about the cattle or the weather or something Lily had said at breakfast, in the way he'd handed her a cup of coffee on the porch 3 weeks ago without asking if she wanted it, the same way she'd handed him one months before, and neither of them had said anything about the echo of it. "I'm not raising it only as a practical question," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that I don't want to watch those children be taken to San Antonio," she said, "and I'm sure that I have been—" She chose the words carefully. "More at home in this house than I have been anywhere in a long time. Those are both true. And I think you can build something real on two things that are true, even if it's not the conventional sequence." He looked at her. "It's not the conventional sequence," he said, and there was something that might have been, in a different context, almost a dry note to it. "No," she said, "but nothing about any of this has been." He reached across the table, not dramatically, just set his hand on the table near hers. Not quite touching, close enough that it was a question. She put her hand over his. They sat like that in the early morning dark for a minute, which was long enough for both of them to know what it meant, and not long enough to say everything it meant, which was probably the right amount. "I'll go see Judge Haller this week," he said finally. "He can perform the ceremony." "Before the 14th, she said. "Before the 14th, he agreed. She told the children that evening, after supper. She'd thought about how to do it all day, whether to tell them together or separately, whether Wade should do it, or she should, or both of them. They decided together, and they sat at the kitchen table after the plates were cleared, and Wade said, "We have something to tell you." 4 faces. Ethan's careful, already scanning for what kind of news this was. Claire's attentive, hands in her lap. Lily watching her father. Owen watching Evelyn. "Miss Carter and I are going to get married," Wade said. "Next week, before the county court date." Silence. Lily looked at Evelyn. "Does that mean you're staying?" she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "That's what it means." Lily looked back at her father. Then she looked at Evelyn again. Then she picked up buttons from beside her plate and held them against her chest, which was what she did when she was processing something important. Clara said very quietly, "Because of the court thing?" "Partly," Evelyn said. She'd decided not to dress it up. Clara was 10 years old and had been running emotional inventory on this household for a year. She deserved the truth. "And partly because your father and I—" She paused, finding the right shape for it. "Because we've been honest with each other, and because I think we can build something good here. Both of those things are true." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at her father. Whatever she found in his face seemed to settle something in her, because she nodded slowly, with the gravitas of a child who has considered a proposal and approved it. Owen said, "Will you still sleep in the storage room?" Wade made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "No," Evelyn said. "I'll move into the— There'll be some rearranging." "Will Buttons have to share?" Lily asked. "Buttons can stay where Buttons has always been," Evelyn said. Lily seemed satisfied with this. Ethan hadn't said anything. He'd been watching the whole exchange from across the table with his arms folded and his jaw doing the thinking thing it did. "Ethan," Wade said. "I heard," Ethan said. Then, "Are you going to be okay? Both of you. Not the court. I mean, are you actually going to be okay?" Wade looked at him. "I think so," he said. "I believe so." Ethan looked at Evelyn. "I think so too," she said. He nodded. It was not enthusiasm and it was not opposition. It was the nod of a young man who had been the responsible one for a long time and was checking whether it was safe to hand that weight to someone else, and had decided, provisionally, that it might be. "The hinge on the root cellar," he said after a moment. "I fixed it last week, but the new pin I put in is a different size and it's going to work itself loose before spring." "I'll get the right size from Grady's," Wade said. "I'll write down what you need," Ethan said, and pushed back from the table and went to find paper. The storm came 2 days before the wedding. November in West Texas was usually dry, but every few years the Gulf pushed something up through the southern counties, and it arrived fast and wrong. The kind of weather that felt like a mistake, sleet mixed with rain, and a wind that leaned on everything it touched. Evelyn had seen it coming in the afternoon sky. The particular green-gray of it, the way the cattle on the south pasture had bunched up and turned their backs to the southwest. And she'd told Wade at the midday meal that it looked serious. "I'll get the horses in before supper," he said. He didn't make it before supper. The storm hit at 4 o'clock, faster than the sky had promised, and it hit hard. The windows shaking in their frames, rain and sleet driving sideways against the south wall of the house. The temperature dropping 20 degrees in an hour. She got the children inside and the fire up and the lamps lit, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the barn and the dark yard and the weather coming down, and she counted the time since Wade had gone out. An hour. He'd been out just over an hour. She gave it 10 more minutes, and then she put on her coat. "Miss Carter," Ethan started. "Keep the fire up," she said. "Don't let Owen near the stove. You shouldn't go out there." She was already out the door. The yard was a different world. The rain and sleet hit her sideways, and the cold was immediate and total. The kind of cold that got inside your clothes in the first 30 seconds and stayed there. She had the lamp, but the wind was working at it hard, and she cupped it with her body as she went. The barn was 60 feet from the house across the yard, and 60 feet was a long way in weather like this. She couldn't see the barn lights, which was wrong, which meant either the barn lamp was out or had never been lit. She found him at the side of the barn. He'd been coming back for the lamp. He'd been at the pasture fence, she understood later, closing the gate that the wind had pushed open, and he'd come back at a run and gone down when his boot caught on the fence post that lay in the mud where it had fallen from the repair stack. He was down in the mud outside the barn wall with one hand on the post he'd tripped over and the other flat in the mud, trying to get up, and the way he was holding his right side told her something before he said anything. "Wade." She got down beside him, lamp in the mud, both hands on him. "How bad?" "Ribs," he said through his teeth. "I went down hard. I can get up." "Don't get up fast. I can—" "Wade." She put her hand flat on his chest, not hard, just stopping him. "Slow, okay? Slow." He went slow. It took 2 minutes to get him upright and another minute to get him moving toward the house, with his arm over her shoulder and her arm around him, and the sleet doing everything it could to complicate the process. He was heavier than she'd expected. She'd known he was a large man, but it was different when the weight was on her. And she was not going to fall down in this yard, she decided. Was absolutely not going to fall down, and she didn't. She got him into the kitchen. The children were all there. Clara had kept the others back, but they were all there. And she registered their faces as she got Wade to the nearest chair. Lily frightened, Owen very still, Clara already moving to get towels, Ethan coming forward to take Wade's other side. "I've got him," she said. "Ethan, there's a lantern still out in the yard. Go get it, and then come inside and stay inside." "Is Pa—" "He fell. Ribs. He's all right. Lantern first." Ethan went. Clara brought towels. Evelyn got Wade's coat off him, which he helped with in a stiff, careful way that confirmed the ribs were real, and she put her hand along his right side and felt what she was feeling for. 2 at minimum, she said. "Maybe 3. Can you breathe?" "Breathing fine," he said. "It's when I move." "Cracked? Not broken," she said. "Broken you'd know differently." She'd seen broken ribs once before. On a ranch she'd worked briefly in her early 20s, and the breathing had been the thing. His breathing was rough from the cold and the exertion, but regular. "You need to stay still. The horses are in the barn. I could see them through the door when we came in." She looked at him directly. "You're going to sit in this chair and not move significantly until I tell you otherwise." He looked at her. She looked at him. "All right," he said. She wrapped him and got him dry and made him drink hot coffee and assessed the ribs again with more attention and maintained her read. Cracked, painful, not dangerous if he kept still for a few days. She'd get Doc Hartley in the morning if the weather cleared. For now the priority was keeping him warm and immobile, which were not things Wade Mercer was naturally inclined toward. The children rotated around him for the rest of the evening, Owen bringing him a blanket he hadn't asked for and draping it with meticulous care. Lily sitting on the floor near his chair with Buttons, Clara, and Ethan both pretending to do normal things while clearly watching him from their peripheral vision. Evelyn cooked supper and pretended not to notice any of it. Around 8, after the little ones were in bed and Ethan had gone up, Wade was still in the kitchen chair because standing had been demonstrated to be inadvisable. Evelyn was at the table finishing the supply list she'd been working on that morning. The storm had calmed to a steady rain, the sleet gone, the temperature still cold but no longer hostile. "You didn't have to come out after me," he said. "You'd been out for over an hour," she said, without looking up from the list. "Still?" She looked up. He was watching her with the careful, direct look he'd been giving her more often recently, the one that said something he hadn't finished saying. The lamplight did something to the planes of his face, softer than the usual daylight, and she was aware in a practical way that she'd been aware of things like that about him for a while now. "Wade," she said, "I want to say something." "Then say it." He was quiet for a moment, picking his way toward it. "When you sat down across from me 2 days ago and told me the practical solution to our problem, I said I'd been trying to find a way to say something for 6 weeks. "I remember," she said. "I want to say it now." He held her gaze. "Not the practical version, the other one." She waited. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I want you to know that going in. I know that I shut down. I know I go into the work when I don't know what else to do. And I know that's cost my children things they needed this year, and I know it's a pattern and not an excuse." He paused. "But I know when something is real. And what has been happening in this house since August is real. And you are the reason most of it is real. And I would want to marry you regardless of the court date." The rain was steady against the windows. The fire had settled into coals. "I know you're not doing this only for the practical reason either," he said. "I think I know that. But I wanted to say it out loud so there was no confusion." She looked at him across the table. He was sitting in a kitchen chair with cracked ribs and mud still in the crease of his boot because she hadn't gotten to that yet, and his face was doing the thing where it wasn't quite hiding what it felt. "There's no confusion," she said. He nodded. Something in him eased. A small thing, but real. "You should sleep in the downstairs room tonight," she said. "The stairs are going to be unpleasant." "I know," he said. "I was already thinking that." "I'll get the spare bedding." She got up, and he said quietly, "Evelyn." She looked at him. "Thank you," he said, "for coming out in that." She held his look for a moment. "You'd have done the same," she said, and went to get the bedding. To court. They married on a Thursday, 4 days before the court date, in Judge Haller's office in Harlow Crossing, which was not a large office, and was made smaller by the presence of May Tolliver, who had arrived uninvited and was not going to leave, Doc Hartley, who was Wade's witness, Clara, who had asked quietly the night before if she could be there and been told yes, and Ethan, who had said he didn't need to come and had come anyway, appearing in the doorway of Judge Haller's office in his good shirt with his hair combed and his jaw set. The ceremony was brief. Judge Haller was a practical man who understood what they were there for and conducted proceedings accordingly. Wade stood on her left with his right arm held slightly stiff from the ribs, which were healing but had opinions about sudden movements. Evelyn wore her second dress, which was better than her first, and had done her hair with slightly more care than usual, which May Tolliver noticed and approved of with a single nod. When it was done, the papers signed, the hands shaken, May Tolliver already forming opinions about what kind of celebration was appropriate and beginning to communicate them, Clara came and stood beside Evelyn and did not say anything, just stood there, which was enough. Outside in the gray November street, Ethan fell into step beside her on the way to the wagon. "You're sure?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm sure," she said. He walked another few steps. "The pillowcases," he said. "The ones in the linen cupboard." She looked at him. "Clara and I talked about it," he said. "We thought, for the bedroom, if you wanted, you could use them." She understood what this was. She understood exactly what it was, and she was careful about her face for a moment before she trusted it. "That means a great deal," she said. "Tell Clara that." You can tell her yourself, he said. You live there. He walked ahead to help Wade up onto the wagon seat, which Wade didn't need but tolerated because Ethan needed to do it. And Evelyn stood for a moment in the November street of Harlow Crossing and let what had just happened settle into her before she walked to the wagon and climbed up and rode home through the cold, clear air with her husband and her stepson, and the two of them talking about the fence line, arguing about which posts were salvageable and which were not. Neither of them looking at her, but both of them making room for her in the conversation by leaving spaces in it, the way people did when they decided you belonged in the room. She looked at the road ahead and the flat West Texas land opening out around them, and she thought about a letter she'd read at a kitchen table in Kansas at the beginning of August, which had said nothing about any of this, and she thought, well, here we are. And the wagon moved forward through the cold November morning toward home. The 4 days between the wedding and the court date were not peaceful days. Evelyn hadn't expected them to be. The Aldridge family's lawyer, a man named Garrett Foss, who had come up from San Antonio specifically for this and was staying at the only hotel in Harlow Crossing which said something about how seriously Franklin Aldridge was taking the matter, sent a preliminary document to Judge Haller's court 2 days before the hearing. She and Wade read it at the kitchen table that evening after the children were in bed, and it was, she had to admit, a thorough piece of work. Foss had pulled everything available: the mortgage records, the feed account balance from the difficult months after Ruth died, the welfare complaint in its full original language, not the dismissal, just the complaint, and a statement from a county clerk she'd never met attesting to the general instability of the Mercer Ranch operation in the preceding year. He had also included, in the final section, a paragraph about the marriage. It described it as hasty, used the phrase sudden and unverified domestic arrangement twice, which was once more than necessary, and it noted that the marriage had taken place 4 days before the custody hearing, which it implied was not coincidental, which of course it wasn't, but the implication was designed to make the timing look cynical rather than honest. Wade read that paragraph and set the papers down. He's going to say we got married to game the hearing, he said. Yes, Evelyn said. And he's not entirely wrong. He's partially wrong, she said. Which is different. She looked at the paragraph again. We need to be ready for that question in the courtroom. The judge is going to ask it, or Foss is going to ask it, and the answer matters. What is the answer? She looked at him across the table. His ribs were still tender. He moved carefully, and there were moments in the day when she could see the cost of ordinary motion in his face, and he was tired in the way that accumulated and didn't clear with one night's sleep. The answer is the truth, she said. The whole truth, not the convenient version of it. Yes, the timing was driven by the court date, and yes, there was already something real between us before that. Both of those things are true, and neither of them cancels the other out. She paused. If we walk into that courtroom with a cleaned-up version of this, Foss will find the edge of it and pull, and the whole thing comes apart. The truth is actually more defensible than a story. He considered this. You think a judge is going to find that convincing? I think a judge who's spent 20 years in a county courthouse has seen every variety of human situation and is generally better at reading what's real than people give him credit for, she said. I think the truth is what it is, and I think we have 4 months of everything else on our side. He was quiet. Wade, she said, do you trust me? He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the lamplight, with the papers between them and the house quiet around them. Yes, he said, without hesitation, which was the right way to say it. Then let me handle tomorrow, she said. You answer what you're asked. You don't elaborate. You don't defend. You let me and May Tolliver and Doc Hartley do what we came to do. He looked like a man being asked to do something that was against his nature, which it was. He was not a man who stood back. All right, he said. So, the Calhoun County Courthouse was a single-story stone building on the north end of Harlow Crossing's Main Street, and on the morning of December 14th, it had more people in it than it usually held on any day that wasn't a land dispute or a criminal proceeding. Evelyn noted this when they came up the front steps, the people in the hall, the faces she recognized and some she didn't, May Tolliver already inside and already in conversation with 3 women from the Ladies' Aid Society, Doc Hartley near the door with his hat in his hands. She also noted Franklin Aldridge. He was standing at the far end of the hall with Garrett Foss, and he was what she'd expected from the lawyer's letter. A man in his 50s, well-dressed in the San Antonio way, with a face that had the particular set of someone who believed that what they were doing was right, and had never seriously considered the possibility that they might be wrong. He looked at Wade when they came in with the dispassionate assessment of a man examining a problem he was confident he could solve. He looked at Evelyn with something she couldn't quite name. Not hostility, more like he hadn't fully accounted for her and was recalculating. She met his gaze and then looked away, because there was nothing to be gained from staring down a man across a courthouse hallway, and there was plenty to be lost. The children were not there. They'd discussed it. Wade had wanted them present. She'd said no. Not because she thought it would go badly, but because children should not be in a room where adults fight over them. It wasn't fair to them, and it wasn't useful. Ethan had argued about this, which she'd expected, and she'd told him plainly that his job today was to keep his siblings fed and occupied, and that this was a more important job than sitting in a courthouse, which he didn't entirely believe but accepted. Judge Clarence Haller was a different judge than the one who'd performed the marriage ceremony. That was his brother. The family resemblance was noticeable. And he came in without ceremony, sat down, looked at the room over his spectacles, and said, "Let's begin." Garrett Foss was good at his job. She'd expected that, and she wasn't wrong. He opened by walking through the documented record with the patient thoroughness of a man who had prepared extensively and intended to use every page. The mortgage arrears from the spring, there, in the ledger. The feed account balance, documented. The welfare complaint, filed and on record. He did not misrepresent anything, which was almost more effective than misrepresentation, because the record was real and he was just reading it. Then he made his argument, which was that the Mercer household had demonstrated, over the preceding year, a pattern of financial and domestic instability that put the welfare of 4 minor children at risk, and that the Aldridge family, with resources, stability, established residence in San Antonio, and blood relation to the children, represented a superior alternative. He was measured and reasonable about it. He didn't attack Wade directly. He didn't need to. Then he raised the marriage. "I want to address a development of which the court is likely aware," Foss said, in the smooth, even tone of someone who had planned where to place this. "Mr. Mercer and the household employee, Miss Carter, now Mrs. Mercer, married 4 days ago. 4 days before this hearing." He let that sit. "The court may draw its own conclusions about the timing. I would simply note that a marriage contracted in immediate anticipation of a custody hearing is not evidence of domestic stability. It is evidence of an awareness that domestic stability was lacking." Judge Haller made a note and looked over his spectacles at Wade's side of the room. Counsel for the respondent. Evelyn had retained a lawyer, a local man named Aldous Briggs, who was not Garrett Foss but who knew this county and this judge, and had been doing family law here for 15 years, which was worth more than sophistication in this particular room. Briggs stood up and made his opening, which was competent and grounded, and then he called his witnesses. Doc Hartley first. Hartley testified to his knowledge of the Mercer family over 14 years, to the condition of the children at his last examination 2 months prior, to the specifics of what he'd observed on his visit to the ranch in November. He was the kind of witness who was hard to rattle, because he stated facts and only facts, and he stated them with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been telling the truth in professional capacities for 30 years. Foss cross-examined him on the welfare complaint. "You were not present when the complaint was filed," Foss said. "No," Doc Hartley said. "And you have no professional knowledge of what prompted the complaint." "I have professional knowledge of what I observed when I visited the household and examined the children," Hartley said, "which was a well-maintained home and 4 children in good health who were clearly being properly looked after." The complaint was filed and dismissed," Hartley said pleasantly. "I'm aware of the distinction." May Tolliver was next. Evelyn had thought hard about putting May on the stand because May was someone who could go in any direction once she had a platform. But she also knew that May had been in that house and had seen it with her own eyes, which was not something Foss could easily argue with. May testified about the visit in October, the kitchen, the garden, the children, the cornbread, and she testified about it with the blunt specificity of a woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Mrs. Tolliver, Foss said in cross-examination, you've described a household that appeared to be functioning adequately. But your visit was arranged, was it not? After the welfare complaint was filed? I went when Miss Carter invited me, May said, which she did because she had nothing to hide. Or because she wanted to manage appearances. Mr. Foss, May said, with the particular patience of someone who has made a decision about how this conversation is going, I have been in and out of that ranch since before Ruth Mercer died. I have left food at that gate more times than I've counted because I was worried about those children. What I saw in October was not an appearance. It was a household that had been in difficulty and had been put right. Those are different things. Foss moved on. Then Briggs called Evelyn. She'd known this was coming, and she'd prepared for it in the only way she knew how, which was to decide what she was going to say and then say it without dressing it up. She took the stand and looked at Judge Haller, who was looking at her with the neutral attention of a man who had not yet made up his mind, which was what she'd hoped for. Briggs took her through the basics, chum, when she'd arrived, what the household had been like, what her work had involved, the changes over the preceding months. She answered clearly and specifically, the way she always did when precision mattered. Then Briggs asked about the marriage. Mrs. Mercer, he said, opposing counsel has characterized your marriage to Mr. Mercer as a calculated response to this hearing. How would you respond to that? She looked at the judge, not at Foss, not at Franklin Aldridge across the room. I would say it was both, she said. Briggs didn't react. They talked about this. The court date was a factor in the timing, she said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would be a lie, and it would be a lie in front of a judge, which seems like a poor decision. There was a slight sound from somewhere behind her that might have been May Tolliver suppressing something. What I can tell you is what was true before the court date was on our minds. I arrived at the Mercer Ranch in August as a housekeeper. What I found was a household in grief and a family that was surviving but not doing much more than that. I stayed because I thought I could help, and because those children deserved someone who wasn't going to leave. She paused. Over 4 months, I came to know this family. Not as an employee knows an employer, as a person knows people they've lived alongside and worked alongside and sat with at a kitchen table every morning. She kept her voice even. The feelings that developed between Mr. Mercer and myself were real before the Aldridge letter arrived. The letter changed the urgency of the timeline. It did not create the reason. Judge Haller was watching her. The question I think this court is actually trying to answer, she said, and Foss started to rise and the judge held up one hand, not looking at him, still looking at her, and Foss sat back down. Is whether those 4 children are in a home where they are known and loved and being raised by people who are committed to them. I cannot give you a legal argument for that. I can tell you what I know. I can tell you that Ethan Mercer is 13 years old and spent the better part of this year believing it was his job to hold his entire family together, and that he is slowly, carefully learning that it isn't. I can tell you that Clara makes bread the way her mother taught her and cries sometimes in the kitchen when she thinks no one is watching, and both of those things are true, and both of them are healthy. I can tell you that Owen has a rock on his nightstand that his father helped him break open, and that the quartz crystals inside it are exactly what Owen thought they'd be. She looked at the judge steadily. I can tell you that Lily's rabbit is named Buttons, and her mother made him, and that Lily has been leaving him on the porch some afternoons now, which means she's starting to feel safe enough to put down the things she's been holding. She paused. I don't know what Franklin Aldridge's house in San Antonio looks like. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's stable and comfortable and appropriate by every measure this court uses. But those children are not looking for a fine house. They are looking for the people who know which pillowcases belong in the back left corner of the linen cupboard and why. That is what I can offer. That is what their father offers. And that is, in my experience, what matters. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Haller looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his papers. Cross-examination, Mr. Foss? He said. Foss stood. He was a professional, and he knew when a moment had gone against him, and he adjusted without showing it, which she respected even now. Mrs. Mercer, he said, you mentioned feelings that developed before the Aldridge letter arrived. Can you give the court a specific date on which you decided you intended to marry Mr. Mercer? No, she said. No? That's not how it works, she said. That's not how it works for anyone. I didn't write it in a ledger. She looked at him calmly. I can tell you that the morning I sat down across from Wade Mercer and raised the possibility of marriage, I was not raising something that surprised either of us. That's the most precise I can be. Foss tried 2 more angles, neither of which found purchase, and sat down. Franklin Aldridge testified briefly, in his own behalf. He was composed and articulate and said what Evelyn had expected, that the family had resources the Mercer ranch could not match, that the children were his late sister's children, and the Aldridge family felt a responsibility to them, that he was not motivated by anything other than their welfare. He was convincing. She thought he probably believed what he was saying, which was the thing that made him most dangerous, and also, ultimately, the thing that made him most limited. A man who believed he was acting purely from principle was sometimes the hardest to argue with, and the easiest to expose, because principle without knowledge was just certainty without basis. Briggs stood for redirect. Mr. Aldridge, he said, when did you last see these children? A pause. At my sister's funeral, in February. That's 10 months ago. Yes. And before the funeral? Another pause. Ruth and I had a period of estrangement, several years. How many years? 5, Aldridge said, and to his credit his voice didn't change, though something behind his eyes did. Approximately. So you last had regular contact with your sister and her family approximately 5 years ago. You have not visited the ranch. You have not maintained correspondence with the children. You have not, to the court's knowledge, sent word to the Mercer household at any point in the 10 months since your sister's death, until this letter. Briggs held up the petition. Is that accurate? Franklin Aldridge looked at the table in front of him. We had differences, he said. I regret them. I'm sure you do, Briggs said. But the children don't know you, Mr. Aldridge, do they? Aldridge didn't answer immediately. In the silence, Evelyn looked at him. At the set of his jaw, there contained something in his face that was not quite guilt, but was in that territory. And she understood, for the first time, that this was not purely a legal maneuver. He had lost his sister, and he had not been reconciled to her, and now he was here, in this courthouse, trying to do something about it through the only avenue still available. And the avenue was wrong, but the grief behind it was real. That didn't change anything. It didn't change what was right for Ethan and Clara and Owen and Lily. But she understood it, and understanding it was different from the cold opposition she'd been carrying into this room. They don't know me, Aldridge said, finally, quietly. No. Judge Haller took a recess of 40 minutes. She and Wade sat in the hall with Briggs, not talking much. Wade had his hat in his hands and was turning it in the way he turned things when he was keeping still by an effort of will. She sat beside him and put her hand over his hat-turning hands without comment, and he stilled. May Tolliver came and stood nearby and was, uncharacteristically, quiet. When they went back in, Judge Haller settled at his bench and looked over the room with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was ready to state it plainly. This is not a complicated case, he said, which Evelyn suspected was directed partly at Foss, despite the effort that has gone into making it appear so. The court has heard testimony about a household that experienced genuine hardship over the preceding year following the death of a mother and wife. The court has also heard testimony about what that household looks like today, which is substantially different from its condition at the worst point. The question before this court is whether the current arrangement serves the welfare of 4 minor children. He looked at the papers in front of him. The welfare complaint of October is noted and dismissed, as it was dismissed by the county welfare officer on the basis of his direct inspection. A pause. The financial record of the Mercer Ranch shows a household that met its obligations, retired its debt, and is currently operating within its means. These are not the marks of an irresponsible operation. Foss was still at his table. Franklin Aldridge was looking at the judge. With respect to the marriage, Haller said, and Evelyn held herself very still. The court notes the timing and does not find it disqualifying. The testimony of the witnesses, taken as a whole, suggests a household that had already found stability before the Aldridge petition prompted the formal change in arrangement. The timing of the marriage reflects the urgency of legal circumstance, not the absence of genuine foundation. The court has heard enough in the past 4 hours to form a view on that question. He set down his papers and looked over the room. The petition for custody filed by Franklin Aldridge on behalf of the Aldridge family is denied. He said it plainly, without drama. The 4 minor children, Ethan, Clara, Lily, and Owen Mercer, are found to be in the appropriate care of their father and stepmother, in a household that meets the welfare standards of this county. This matter is closed. He banged the gavel once. The sound of it moved through the room, and then the room moved. May Tolliver exhaling audibly, Doc Hartley getting to his feet, Briggs making a note, Foss gathering his papers with the practiced neutrality of a professional who had lost cases before and knew how to do it cleanly. Wade sat very still beside her for a moment. Then he let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long-held, the kind of breath a person took when they'd been braced for impact and the impact hadn't come. She felt it more than heard it. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was nothing to say that was equal to it, so neither of them said anything. She saw Franklin Aldridge once more, in the hall outside the courtroom, on her way back from the water closet while Wade was in final conversation with Briggs. Aldridge was standing by the window at the end of the hall with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and the look of a man who had arrived at somewhere he hadn't expected to arrive. She almost walked past him. Then she stopped. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. He looked at her. Up close, the resemblance to the photograph of Ruth that Wade kept in the desk drawer, she'd found it while looking for a pen, had noted it and put it back, was clearer than it had been across a courtroom. The shape of the jaw. The eyes. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "I want to say something to you," she said, "and I'd ask you to hear it as it's meant, which is not as a victory speech." He waited. "Your sister's children are well," she said. "I want you to know that. Not as a legal statement, not for the record, as a fact. Ethan is going to be a fine man. Claire already has more backbone than most adults I've known. Owen will probably know more about rocks by the time he's 12 than most geologists. And Lily?" She paused. "Lily is the kind of child who names things and keeps them. That's a gift." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, slow and heavy, like something shifting that had been in place a long time. "I should have written," he said, after Ruth died, "to the children directly." "Yes," she said, "you should have, but you can still do that." He looked at her. Would that be received?" "Write to Ethan first," she said. "He'll decide. He's the one who gets to decide." She held his gaze. "He might say no, but he might not, and you won't know if you don't write." She left him at the window and went back to the hall where Wade was waiting, and she did not look back because there was nothing more she could do there, and there was plenty else in front of her. The ride home was different from the ride 4 days earlier when they'd come back from the courthouse after the wedding. Then it had been cold and newly strange, the two of them navigating what they'd just done. Now the strangeness had settled into something else. Not comfortable exactly, but real. The way things became real when they'd been tested and had held. She told Wade about the conversation with Franklin Aldridge when they were halfway back. He was quiet for a moment. "You told him to write to Ethan." "I told him Ethan would decide." Wade looked at the road ahead. "Ethan might not want to." "He might not," she said. "But the option should exist. Those children lost their mother. They don't need to also lose every connection to who she was." He turned this over. She could see him turning it over, the same way she'd seen him with the ledger, getting the real shape of it before he responded. "All right," he said. "I'll leave it to Ethan." They came up the track toward the house in the late afternoon light, the winter sun already going low and orange above the west pasture, and she could see the smoke from the kitchen chimney, which meant Ethan had kept the fire going, which she'd trusted him to do but was glad to see evidenced. Before the wagon had fully stopped, the front door opened. Owen appeared on the porch, and behind him Lily, and behind Lily Clara. Owen looked at the wagon. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at his father. "Did you win?" he said, with the directness that was entirely Owen's own. "Yes," Wade said, getting down from the wagon. "We won." Owen nodded as though this confirmed something he'd already believed. Then he went inside, presumably to update his personal accounting of how things had gone. Lily came down the porch steps and wrapped her arms around Evelyn's waist without saying anything, which was the most Lily had ever done. And Evelyn stood in the winter afternoon and put her arms around the small girl and held on. Clara watched from the porch. "I kept supper warm," she said. "Thank you," Evelyn said against the top of Lily's head. "Ethan fixed the fence by the south gate," Clara added. "He said the post was going to go before spring and he didn't want to wait." From inside the house, Ethan's voice, without him appearing, "I heard the wagon." "Then come out," Evelyn said. A pause. Then the door opened and he came out, still in his barn jacket, and he looked at them, at his father, at Evelyn, at Lily still wrapped around Evelyn's waist. And he looked back at his father specifically. "We're okay?" he said. "We're okay," Wade said. Ethan put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the ground for a moment, and then at the sky in the way people looked at the sky when they were deciding something about how they felt and didn't want to show the deciding. "Supper's going to get cold," he said, and went back inside. Awesome. They ate that evening with the lamps lit and the wind outside doing what the winter wind did in West Texas, which was to remind you that the walls around you were not a small thing. Clara had made stew, a real one, with everything in it, the potatoes cut the way Evelyn had shown her, the broth gone thick and dark from the bones she'd put in that morning. It was very good. Evelyn said so and meant it, and Clara didn't say it was fine. Owen described, in precise and absorbing detail, the geological implications of his quartz discovery to anyone who would listen, which was everyone, because the table had learned that Owen on a subject he'd researched was worth listening to. Wade asked questions with genuine attention, which Owen received as his due. Lily ate her stew and fed Buttons a small piece of potato under the table, which everyone pretended not to see. After supper, after the dishes were done, and the little ones were in bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the quiet of the house settling around her. Wade came in from checking the horses and poured himself coffee and sat across from her and didn't say anything for a while, which was fine, because they'd reached the point where silence between them was not a gap, but a thing with its own texture. "The pillowcases are on the bed," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "Clara put them on this morning before we left. I saw them." He turned his coffee cup. "Ruth would have—" He stopped. "She would have been glad the children are all right. That's all I was going to say." Evelyn looked at him. "I know," she said. "I believe that." He nodded, and they sat in the comfortable quiet of the kitchen with the fire going and the wind outside and the house full and quiet. This was the thing about families, she thought. Not the word of it, not the legal arrangement or the ceremony or the formal declaration, but the actual substance. It was this. It was supper that got cold if you didn't come in. It was a girl who came down the porch steps and held on without saying anything, and a boy who fixed a fence post rather than sit still with his worry, and a man who came in a little earlier from the fields every evening and was learning to leave space in conversations for people he loved. It was the back left corner of a linen cupboard and what you kept there and why. She'd come to Texas with a suitcase and $43 and a letter that had said nothing about any of this, and she had learned something in the months since that she'd known in parts before, but had never held all at once. That the life worth having was almost never the one you'd packed for. That the people who ended up mattering most were almost always the ones you hadn't planned on. That trust was not a feeling that arrived whole. It was a thing you built with your hands, one day at a time, out of whatever you had. She'd been wrong about some things. She'd burned the eggs. She'd put the pillowcases on the wrong beds and hurt a girl who was already hurting. She'd kept a photograph face down on a windowsill for too long, managing something she should have been living through. She'd come to this ranch thinking she knew the shape of hard work, and found out that hard work in a household full of grief had dimensions she hadn't mapped. None of that had been smooth, and none of it had been easy, and she didn't think the road from here was going to be smooth or easy either. Cracked ribs healed, but the winter was still the winter. The spring cattle market was unpredictable. Ethan was going to be 14, and 14 was its own kind of difficult. Clara was going to cry in the kitchen some mornings, and not others, and that was going to be true for a long time. Owen was going to have questions that nobody knew how to answer, and Lily was going to hold on to things that needed holding until she didn't need to hold them anymore. And there was going to be a morning somewhere in the future. She couldn't see it, but she knew it was there. When she stood at the kitchen stove in the early light, and it was going to feel, not like arriving, but simply like being. Like here was the place. Not perfect, not complete, not finished. A ranch and a family and a life in progress. But hers, in every way that mattered. She was not there yet. But she knew the direction now, and in her experience, that was most of the work. Wade finished his coffee and got up and went to check the door latch, which was a thing he did every night, a quiet circuit of the ground floor before he went up. She listened to his steps, kitchen, front room, back porch door, front door, and she picked up her tea and she looked at the lamp burning on the table, and she thought about Owen's quartz crystals and how he'd said you had to break the rock open, right, or you'd wreck them. She thought, yes, that's exactly it. Some things you had to get at carefully, not because they were fragile, quartz was harder than most things, but because they were worth the care. Because getting there slowly meant you found what was actually inside, instead of just the version of it you'd expected. Wade came back through the kitchen on his way to the stairs. He paused behind her chair. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, the way you touch someone when there weren't words for it, when the thing you meant was too large and too ordinary at the same time to fit into language. She put her hand over his. Then he went upstairs. She sat for another few minutes in the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch on a December night in West Texas, with the wind outside and the fire inside and the house full of sleeping children, and she finished her tea and she turned down the lamp, and she went upstairs too.